What if the mask you wore on Halloween could never be taken off? Chicago, 1929. The city pulsed with jazz, prohibition liquor, and shadows taller than its buildings. Amid the flicker of jack-o'-lanterns and the smog of alley bonfires, a circle of masked revelers made a bargain they could not undo. One by one, the faces they wore became their only faces, their flesh knitting to paper, bone bending beneath painted grins. And as November's dawn refused to break their spell, they discovered that masks have hungers of their own. Subscribe, if you dare, to step deeper into the alleyway of forgotten rituals, where every tale is a mirror, and every mirror hides a face that isn't yours. The city groaned that autumn, as though it too could feel the weight of the coming winter. Chicago, 1929, a place of endless noise and endless hunger. The streets trembled beneath the boots of gangsters and policemen alike. Prohibition whiskey staining the alleys, smoke from illicit stills mingling with the river fog. But when October arrived, something older than bullets and bootleggers stirred in the air. For 1 month only, Chicago ceased to be a city of men and machines, and instead became a carnival of whispers, a theater where the stage was the sky itself. On the final night of October, the harvest moon rose swollen and red above the skyline, staining the streets like a smear of blood. It gleamed on the slick cobblestones, on the collapsed grins of jack-o'-lanterns rotting on stoops, on the black water of the Chicago River, thick with secrets. Children sang twisted rhymes as they ran between tenements, carrying paper masks that tore in the rain. From the corner of Maxwell Street came the faint chant of an old-world ritual, a family burning dried herbs in a cauldron of iron, whispering prayers in a tongue older than the city itself. But beyond these small fires and fleeting traditions, there were others who sought something grander, something dangerous. 7 souls, each young, each hungry in their own way, conspired to transform a decayed theater into their sanctuary for the night. They were artists, poets, and musicians, strays wandering through the ruins of America's dream as the Great Depression's first tremors began to shake the streets. To them, the masquerade was not just a party, it was rebellion. To wear a mask was to escape identity, to cast aside the world that demanded they labor, starve, or sell themselves to survive. They found the masks by accident, or so they thought. A peddler sat at the corner of Halsted, where shadows swallowed the lamplight. His wares were laid out on a threadbare cloth, masks painted with grotesque expressions, each one more unsettling than the last. There were faces of hollow sorrow, mouths split too wide in laughter, eyes stretched in eternal terror. The paint gleamed even in the dark, as though wet with unseen dew. The peddler's eyes were black as coal and burned with something deeper than hunger. "Wear them until midnight," he whispered, his voice the crackle of dying wood. "And you will never be the same." They laughed, as young dreamers laugh when warned of danger. They paid him with coins that rattled like bones and carried the masks back through the alleys. All the while, the harvest moon followed above, casting their shadows longer and sharper until they seemed less like people and more like puppets dangling on invisible strings. By the time they reached the theater, the air had turned heavy, swollen with rain and smoke. The boards of the building groaned as though remembering every performance, every ghost that once sang upon its stage. One by one they lifted the masks and pressed them to their faces. The silence that followed was deep, cavernous, a silence that seemed to swallow the city's noise in a single breath. Then came the first gasp. The masks were warm. Not the warmth of fabric against flesh, but the warmth of living skin, pulsing, breathing, almost as if the faces themselves had blood in their veins. One of them staggered back, clawing at his cheek, only to feel the painted grin throb beneath his touch. The others laughed nervously, dismissing it as imagination. But deep down, in the marrow of their bones, they each knew something had already begun. The derelict theater was a corpse of grandeur, its velvet curtains moth-eaten, its chandeliers sagging with dust. Yet for 1 night only, it was reborn. Candles hissed in broken sconces, gramophones sputtered jazz through warped brass mouths, and smuggled bottles of wine glimmered like rubies on the cracked floorboards. The air was thick with smoke, incense, and laughter that carried too sharply, too desperately, like the sound of revelers in denial of their own doom. They danced in their masks, the 7 of them, as shadows multiplied across the walls. The theater's ruinous walls made everything larger than life. A trumpet's blare became a scream, the stamp of shoes echoed like thunder. Every movement was heightened, exaggerated, theatrical, and the masks made it stranger still. A sorrowful mask deepened the voice of its wearer until every word trembled with melancholy. A grotesque grin sharpened a man's laughter into something jagged, like glass on stone. The woman in the mask of rage found her body moving with unnatural strength, as though the painted fury seeped into her veins. The longer they wore them, the more the masks seemed to breathe with them, tightening against the skin, molding to every contour. Yet intoxication blurred caution. They poured wine over each other's hands, licked it from painted lips, collapsed into fevered embraces. Some swore they glimpsed their masks shifting in the candlelight, the expressions twitching, eyes rolling as though they watched the dance from behind the paint. But they told themselves it was the smoke, the drink, the storm outside hammering the roof like a drumbeat of war. Beyond the boarded doors, October's storm battered the city. Jack-o'-lanterns guttered in the rain, their carved faces caving into wet pulp. Children fled the streets, clutching their treats as thunder shook the sky. Only the theater remained alight, glowing faintly in the storm like a lantern set adrift on black water. Inside, the revelry reached its crescendo. The masks no longer felt like costumes, they felt like crowns. They forgot their own names, forgot hunger, debt, the cold iron grip of the world outside. Here they were gods of the stage, each painted face an eternal archetype. Time itself seemed to dissolve, hours vanishing in a haze of wine, music, and delirium. But time had not stopped. It had only circled, waiting. The clock tower down the street, half collapsed and nearly forgotten, began to toll. The first chime shuddered through the theater like a cannon blast. Candles guttered. Wine glasses trembled. The revelers froze, their laughter still ringing in the rafters. The second chime followed, lower, heavier, rattling the bones beneath their skin. With each strike, their masks seemed to tighten further, as though the sound itself bound them. By the 9th toll, panic had begun to stir. Fingers clawed at ribbons, but the knots had vanished. Nails scraped at painted edges, only to draw blood where skin should have been. The 10th toll was deafening, the 11th nearly unbearable, and then the 12th. The sound split the air like lightning, and their voices broke in screams. The music collapsed, the gramophone needle screeching across wax. The walls seemed to contract around them, and their shadows danced on the curtains as though mocking their agony. Outside, the storm swallowed the echoes. But within the rotting theater, their screams did not stop. Dawn bled weakly over Chicago, but its light did not touch the interior of the theater. The windows, once fractured panes of glass, had fogged with condensation, as though the building itself were exhaling. The air reeked of wax, mildew, and something fouler, something like rotting meat buried too shallow in the soil. Silence hung thick, broken only by the faint scraping of nails against painted plaster. They were no longer masks. One man sat crumpled against the wall, his chest heaving, hands clawing at his own face. Where he pulled, blood welled from beneath the painted edge, running in thin rivers down his collar. The mask did not shift, it pulsed. The grotesque grin upon it widened with each breath, though the man's mouth inside had gone slack with exhaustion. Across from him, a woman tried to wrench free her sorrowful mask, sobbing violently. The tears never reached her chin. They soaked into the papier-mâché, staining the painted cheeks darker, until it seemed the mask itself was weeping. Eloise, whose mask bore the neutral features of a porcelain doll, stood apart, trembling. She pressed her fingers against her reflection in a shattered hand mirror. For a heartbeat, she believed she saw her own eyes staring back, but then the mask's eyes blinked when she did not. Her stomach lurched. She dropped the glass, and it splintered across the floor like a scream breaking into shards. The survivors turned on one another. Panic made them animals. One struck another with a wine bottle, shattering it across his painted brow. But no wound appeared on the mask. Instead, the man shrieked as blood seeped from beneath the plaster, dripping from the edges like ink from a cracked quill. They clawed, they tore, they begged, but their faces no longer belonged to them. The gramophone, forgotten in the corner, spun in silence. Its needle had worn into the center of the wax, scratching an endless hiss. The sound filled the space like a ghost of music, a lullaby for the damned. Outside life went on. Children ran through alleys, kicking at wet leaves, laughing as they played. But they paused when they passed near the theater. Some swore they heard groaning from inside. Others whispered that figures moved behind the boarded windows, silhouettes bending in unnatural ways. One boy claimed that as he looked, a face pressed against the glass, a painted grin smeared with blood, and it mouthed his name though he'd never met it before. Inside, the survivors clung to fragments of sanity. Eloise remembered her grandmother's words, muttered prayers spoken over burning herbs each Halloween. The dead do not like to be mocked. If you wear their faces too long, they will claim yours. She whispered it aloud, trembling, and the others turned to her with desperate hope. There had to be a way to undo this, but when she tried to pray, the mask spoke with her mouth. The words came, but not in her voice. The cadence was wrong, deeper, slurred, as if another tongue moved through her lips. The others recoiled, and Eloise felt the mask's lips curl without her consent. Her reflection in the broken glass laughed, though she herself did not. The city drowned beneath November storms. Rain slicked the streets in black glass, lightning splitting the sky into crooked veins. Chicago was a wounded beast, its alleys coughing steam, its buildings looming like tombstones. Within that restless darkness, the survivors stumbled, hoods drawn tight, their masks hidden beneath scarves and coats. But no disguise could veil the truth. The masks whispered beneath the cloth, voices muffled but insistent, gnawing at the edges of sanity. They sought the peddler. They found him where no streetlight dared to shine, on a corner that seemed carved out of shadow itself. He had no stall, no clothes, no cart this time. Only his figure, still as a statue, rain streaking down his brimmed hat. His eyes burned like embers in a hearth that would never die. When they approached, breathless, trembling, he smiled as though he had been waiting. "You wore them too long," he murmured. His voice was brittle, the crackle of a log collapsing in fire. "Now they are not yours. They are hungry." Eloise stepped forward, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. "Tell us how to stop this." "Tell us how to be free," the peddler tilted his head. "Freedom is not without price. They will not release you empty. They will drink until they are filled." He spoke of a ritual, ancient as the soil beneath their feet. They would need fire, true fire, not of oil or coal, but one fed with bone. They would need blood, their own, given willingly. And they would need sacrifice, not coins, not objects, but memories, love, or futures untaken. Only in surrendering part of themselves could the masks be coaxed to loosen their grip. Lightning tore open the sky, painting the peddler in a flash of silver. For a heartbeat, his face seemed not a face at all, but a mask, painted, grinning, stretched across an emptiness too deep to fathom. Then darkness returned, and he was only a man again, silent and waiting. They argued in the rain, voices sharp, hands shaking. Some shouted they would never bleed for this bargain. Others wept, pleading that death was the only other road. The masks whispered louder, feeding on their despair. Eloise clenched her fists until her nails drew blood, the droplets sliding down her wrists. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of spirits who bartered with mortals only to twist their bargains into chains. Yet she saw no other path. "The ritual," she said, her voice hoarse. "We'll do it," the peddler's eyes gleamed. "Then gather your fire. The full moon will come soon, swollen with hunger. Bring bones, bring ash, bring what you love most. Only then may you find silence again." He turned from them, his coat dissolving into shadow, his presence retreating like smoke in the wind. When they tried to follow, he was gone, leaving only the hiss of rain. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The city around them groaned, thunder shaking its spine. Then one of the men staggered, clutching his face. His mask had changed. Its painted grin split wider, the jaw cracking. and from within, a row of glistening white teeth pushed through the plaster. The mask was growing in my mouth. The graveyard lay at the edge of the city, where the iron fences sagged and weeds grew high as children. The moon above swelled full and white, veiled by clouds that crawled like bruises across the sky. The survivors moved in silence through the crooked stones, carrying bundles of wood, scraps of coffin planks stolen from a nearby undertaker's yard, and bones pried from graves too shallow to keep their secrets. The masks clung to their faces, breathing in tandem with them, watching the night with painted eyes. They built the fire carefully, trembling hands stacking bones atop wood. Splintered fragments of skull and femur glowing pale in the moonlight. The air thickened, as if the ground itself resisted their trespass. Each strike of the flint was swallowed by the wind until, finally, a spark caught. The flames rose reluctant at first, sputtering, then suddenly surged into a roar. It smelled not of wood, but of burnt hair, of marrow boiling in its shell. Eloise stepped forward, knife in hand. She dragged it across her palm, blood falling in dark beads that hissed when they struck the fire. She whispered prayers she half remembered, her grandmother's chants mingled with her own desperate pleas. The fire twisted, stretching higher, but its light was sickly, green at the edges, white at the core. The masks shivered, pulsing against their skin like hearts beating out of rhythm. One by one, the others followed. A lock of hair cast into the blaze, a photograph torn and offered. A silver ring melted in the fire's breath. But the flames hissed each time, spitting sparks like rejection. "It's not enough," Eloise whispered. The ground beneath them trembled. From the black soil, a gust of wind rose colder than any November storm, carrying with it a stench of decay and centuries of silence. Graves split open. Dirt cascaded like sand as skeletal fingers clawed through the earth, reaching for the fire. The masks writhed, the painted mouths stretching wider, sucking at the air with soundless hunger. One man panicked. He stepped too close, and the fire leapt up his arm, swallowing cloth and skin. He screamed, flailing, but the flames did not consume him. They consumed the mask. It shrieked through his throat, a sound not his own, until its painted features cracked and shattered. His body fell hollow, nothing left inside but ash collapsing into the mud. The survivors recoiled in horror. They realized then what the fire demanded. Not tokens, not symbols. It hungered for them. Another man fell to his knees, sobbing. I can't give it more." But the mask upon him laughed, a jagged, hollow sound, and dragged his body forward like a puppet. His screams blended with the flames as his skin blistered, the mask glowing red until it burst into cinders. The smell was unbearable, burnt flesh, marrow snapping, the hiss of souls departing, and then something new. The third body did not burn. It collapsed, twitching, as the mask split open, detaching from flesh. It fell to the ground with a wet sound, twitching like a severed insect. Slowly, with a grotesque grace, it began to crawl away on unseen limbs, dragging itself toward the open graves. Eloise froze, her bloodied hand trembling. The others staggered back, horrified. But the crawling mask stopped, turned, and stared at her with painted eyes that now blinked. By mid-November, the city had begun to whisper. Chicago's streets were never silent, not even in the dead of night, but now the noises had changed. The laughter from jazz clubs seemed strained, carrying a tremor beneath the brass and drums. Footsteps in alleys echoed too long, as though followed by someone unseen. Even the wind sounded different, dragging across the rooftops with a voice like bone-scraping stone. Rumors spread first among children. They whispered of tall figures in alleys, faces painted in grotesque grins that did not move, even when they spoke. Newsboys claimed masked women leaned against lampposts at dawn, humming songs that made their teeth ache. In taverns, drunkards swore the masked musicians in certain clubs never paused for breath, their jazz spiraling higher until the notes collapsed into something more like a wail. The police dismissed these stories as the delirium of poverty and fear. But when bodies began surfacing in the river, skin smooth and featureless where faces should have been, even the skeptics grew uneasy. Inside the decaying theater, the survivors dwindled. Some surrendered completely, no longer fighting the masks as they sank deeper into them, until their movements were no longer human, but marionette-like, jerking and smooth at once. Their laughter filled the empty seats, echoing off mildew-stained walls, though none of it was joyful. Eloise fought on, carving symbols into her flesh with a trembling hand, desperate to anchor her spirit before the mask hollowed her out completely. Her blood smeared the walls, prayers scrawled in red across cracked plaster, but the words bled as fast as her hope. The city itself began to conspire. Street lamps flickered when the masked walked beneath them. Shadows stretched long, even against weak light, stretching like fingers that sought to strangle. Fires burned in alleys, not fed by wood or coal, but by something unseen, smoldering without smoke, glowing pale blue. The smell of charred marrow lingered wherever the mask had passed. The survivors hid themselves in the theater, but even there the air thickened with rot. The floorboards sagged, damp with mold, while the chandeliers swayed though there was no wind. They could no longer tell if the sounds came from the storm outside or from the building itself, moaning as though it had become a living creature. They huddled in corners, clutching bottles of liquor that did nothing to quiet the voices. The masks whispered constantly now. They whispered of immortality, of art perfected, of freedom from hunger and pain. They whispered that to give in was not death but ascension. Some began to believe. One woman removed her clothes and walked naked through the theater, her mask glowing faintly, her body twitching with inhuman grace. Another knelt before the fire pit they had built from bones, offering his hand into the flames until it crisped and blackened. The smell made Eloise gag, but his mask only smiled wider. The storm outside raged louder. Snow fell in sheets, burying the city in white, yet the theater glowed faintly through boarded windows, as if lit from within. On the last night of November, the doors slammed shut of their own accord. The survivors rushed to pry them open, but the wood had fused, the metal warped, as though the building itself had decided none would leave. Eloise woke in the cold dark, surrounded by silence too complete, her breath hanging like smoke. Slowly, she realized every mask in the room, discarded, crawling, or worn, had turned to face her. None of the bodies stirred but the masks. They stared. The theater did not collapse with thunder or flame. It died the way a body dies, slowly, silently, rotting from within until nothing remained but bones. When neighbors finally forced their way inside, weeks after the storm, they found no revelers, no instruments, no laughter. Only silence, thick and unnatural, like the breath had been drawn from the world. The velvet curtains had disintegrated into damp rags. The chandeliers had fallen, glass shattered into glittering teeth across the floor. And lining the walls, where once posters of grand operas and vaudeville acts had hung, were masks. Hundreds of them. They dangled from nails driven into rotting wood, their painted faces slack, yet each one bore the faintest stain of flesh along the edges, as though grown from the bone outward. Some still dripped with what might have been blood, long dried to brown. Others looked wet, as if they had only just been removed. No bodies were ever found. No bones, no clothes, no trace of the 7 who had entered that Halloween night. Only masks, and among them, in the very center of the stage, lay a small book, its cover scorched, its pages warped. Eloise's journal. The writing within was smeared, the ink blurred by water and ash, but a final entry remained legible, scrawled in a desperate hand. Do not wear a mask past midnight. They do not protect you. They do not hide you. They eat you. The city chose silence. The theater was sealed, its name struck from records, its doors chained with iron. But legends do not die with wood and mortar. Children dared each other to leave pumpkins on its steps every October 31st, swearing they heard faint jazz rising from behind boarded windows. Lovers whispered of figures watching from the highest balcony, their faces too white, their mouths too wide. Some swore they saw condensation on the glass, as though something inside still breathed, waiting for the night it might breathe again. Decades passed. The city grew taller, louder, swallowing its ghosts beneath new brick and steel. Yet the theater remained, a black tooth in the jaw of Chicago, unclaimed and unbroken. And each Halloween the peddler returned. He appeared in alleys, on corners where street lamps failed to burn, laying out his threadbare cloth. The masks he offered were grotesque, painted with sorrow, joy, rage, terror. Their colors never faded, their surfaces always slick, as though fresh from a brush dipped in blood. And his eyes, coal-black, ageless, never changed. Whispers spread that those who bought from him never made it to November. That they vanished, leaving only echoes in clubs, alleys, and doorways. That sometimes on windy nights, their laughter still rattled across the rooftops. The theater still stands, boarded and forgotten, its walls streaked with condensation each autumn, as though it wept for what it had swallowed. And if you pass by in October, when the harvest moon hangs swollen and red, you might see movement within. A flicker of candlelight, a shadow swaying to music no living band could play. Or worse, a mask pressed against the glass, waiting,